The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the cozy space of morning roast. The little cafe I had built with my own hands. Each table, each shelf, each corner carried a piece of me. For nearly a decade, it had been my second home, but lately it felt more like my only home. Christmas was always the busiest time of year here. Twinkling lights framed the windows, a tiny tree sat by the counter, and the rich aroma of cinnamon rolls mingled with the scent of fresh coffee. Customers loved the holiday touch. They said it made them feel warm inside. I smiled and nodded whenever I heard that, but deep down, I hadn't felt that warmth in a long time. "David, your tree's crooked." Mrs. Elkins, one of my regulars, teased as she picked up her latte. "It's called personality." I joked back, straightening the star on top. "Like me, imperfect but charming." She chuckled, but her comment struck a nerve. At home, our family tree was also up a little crooked in the corner of the living room. I'd left it like that on purpose, hoping Jessica would come fix it like she always did. "Can't have Christmas without the perfect tree," she used to say, but she hadn't even looked at it this year. The house was quiet when I got home that evening. The glow of the Christmas lights filled the living room, their reflections dancing off the ornaments I'd hung earlier. I stood for a moment, staring at the crooked star, wondering if she'd notice it when she came in. Jessica had texted earlier, "Meeting with the council, late night, don't wait up." I wasn't surprised. Over the past few months, she'd been busier than ever. Meetings, events, strategy sessions. Her work as an environmental activist seemed to consume her. It wasn't just the time, though. It was the way she'd changed. Jessica used to light up the room when she walked in, her energy infectious. But now, she felt like a shadow of herself. Or maybe it was me who had become invisible. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I heard the front door open. I looked up from the couch as she stepped inside, brushing snow off her gray coat. She looked polished. Her hair was styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, and her nails, a soft crimson, were freshly manicured. "You're all dressed up," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Big meeting." Jessica dropped her keys onto the counter and shrugged out of her coat. "Don't start," she said, her voice clipped. "It's part of the job." I frowned. "Looking like you just walked off the cover of a magazine is part of saving the environment?" She sighed, pouring herself a glass of wine. "David, I'm too tired for this." Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at it briefly before flipping it face down. "I was just asking," I said, forcing a smile. "Tree looks good this year. I even left the star crooked for you." Jessica glanced toward the living room, her expression unreadable. "That's nice," she said, sipping her wine, "but I'm going to bed. Long day tomorrow." She didn't even take off her heels before heading upstairs. The next morning, the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen. I'd gotten up early to prep for the cafe's holiday rush. Jessica was still in bed, the blankets pulled over her head like a barrier. I left quietly, stopping to glance at the tree one last time. The star was still crooked. The cafe was alive with its usual of activity. Customers exchanged holiday greetings. The baristas moved like clockwork, and carols played softly in the background. For a few hours, it was easy to forget the growing distance between Jessica and me. But when I returned home that afternoon, the house was eerily quiet again. Her car was gone, but a note was taped to the coffee maker, helping Lindsay. Back later, Lindsay, her coworker. Over the past few months, Lindsay had become her favorite excuse. I'd never met the woman, but her name popped up so often that I was starting to feel like I knew her better than my own wife. I sighed, crumpling the note in my hand. That evening, as I pulled out another box of decorations, something caught my eye. Tucked beneath a pile of tinsel was a small, elegantly wrapped gift box. It was new, definitely not one of ours. The gold paper shimmered in the light, tied with a red ribbon in a perfect bow. Curious, I untied the ribbon and opened it. Inside was a bottle of wine. Expensive, imported, the kind we never bought. When Jessica finally walked in, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the box and bottle in front of me. She froze for half a second before recovering. "What's that?" she asked casually. "I was going to ask you the same thing," I said, my tone even. Jessica stepped closer, studying the bottle. "Oh, it's a thank you gift from the council. I must have tossed it in with the decorations by mistake." Her explanation was quick, Too quick. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Generous counsel, I said, holding the bottle up to the light. Jessica shrugged. It's just wine, David. Don't overthink it. She turned and walked upstairs, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. Later that night, I stood in the glow of the tree, staring at the crooked star. Jessica used to Christmas songs while we decorated, laughing when the lights tangled and teasing me about my lack of patience. But now, the silence was deafening. The first cracks in our foundation were starting to show. The next day started the same as the last. Jessica was still asleep when I left for the cafe, her side of the bed untouched and cool. I wondered if she had even come to bed the night before, or just stayed up working. Lately, working seemed to be her go to escape from, well, everything. At morning roast, the holiday rush was in full swing. Customers lined up for their peppermint mochas, chatting about last-minute shopping and family gatherings. Normally, their cheer was infectious, but today, it barely reached me. By the time I got home that afternoon, Jessica was gone again. A folded note sat on the kitchen table. Lindsay needs help with something urgent. Be back later. The words felt robotic, like they'd been written 100 times before. I tossed the note aside and walked into the living room. The tree stood where I'd left it, the crooked star still defying gravity. Jessica didn't come home until nearly 8 p.m. this time. I was halfway through reheating leftovers when I heard her heels click against the floor. She walked in, her gray coat slung over one arm and a shopping bag in the other. You're late, I said, setting the plates on the counter. Lindsay, she replied as if that explained everything. She's going through a lot right now. I couldn't just leave her hanging. I glanced at the bag in her hand. The logo of an upscale boutique stared back at me, its bold lettering practically screaming, not for Lindsay. Shopping therapy? I asked, forcing a smile. Jessica paused, then gave me one of her practice laughs. It's for the council gift exchange. You know how these things are? I nodded, even though I didn't know. Not really. Jessica's world of meetings and activism felt like a separate universe from mine. Dinner's ready, I said, sliding her plate across the counter. Jessica barely touched her food, scrolling through her phone between sips of wine. Her answers to my questions were clipped, her gaze distant. The silence between us was thick, broken only by the occasional buzz of her phone. The next morning, I decided to take the day off from the cafe. Something about the last few days had left a weight on my chest, and I needed to shake it off. Jessica was already up, dressed in a tailored blazer and high heels that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. She looked like she was heading to a board meeting, not another strategy session with Lindsay. You're up early, I said, leaning against the counter with my coffee. Big day, she replied, slipping her laptop into a leather bag. Lots to cover. With Lindsay again? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Jessica stiffened slightly before shrugging, among others. Why? No reason, I said, holding her gaze a second too long. Jessica sighed, slinging her bay over her shoulder. David, I don't have time for this. I'll see you tonight. Don't wait up. She kissed me on the cheek, barely, and walked out the door, her heels clicking like punctuation marks to end the conversation. That afternoon, I found myself wandering through town. Snow fell in soft flurries, dusting the streets and storefronts. The town square was alive with holiday cheer. Families taking pictures by the tree, couples holding hands as they browsed the Christmas market. For a moment, I felt lighter. Maybe I'd been imagining things. Maybe Jessica really was just busy. But then I saw her. Jessica stood across the street, her back to me, talking to someone, a man. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat and scarf. His posture relaxed. From where I stood, I couldn't make out his face, but the way Jessica tilted her head toward him, the way her hand briefly touched his arm, it wasn't the kind of interaction you'd expect between colleagues. My chest tightened as I watched them laugh, their breath visible in the cold air. They didn't notice me as they walked into a cafe, disappearing behind the frosted glass doors. For a moment, I stood frozen on the sidewalk. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, each more painful than the last. Part of me wanted to march across the street to confront her then and there, but something held me back. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture. That night, Jessica came home late again. She walked through the door with a bright smile, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Long day, I asked, my voice calm. Jessica hesitated, unwinding her scarf. Exhausting, she said, setting her bag down. The council's really pushing hard before the holidays. Meetings, planning sessions, you name it. I nodded, forcing a smile. Sounds intense. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, as if she was searching for something in my expression. But then she turned away, heading upstairs without another word. As the sound of her footsteps faded, I pulled out my phone and stared at the picture I'd taken earlier. Jessica and the man in the dark coat. I didn't know who he was, but I knew one thing for certain: something wasn't right. The next morning started with the sound of rain, tapping softly against the windows. The snow had turned to slush overnight. The bright white of Christmas, now a dreary gray. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot as it gurgled. Jessica's side of the bed had been empty again when I woke up, the blankets untouched. She'd come home late last night, her smile bright and her excuses brighter. I wanted to believe her. For years, Jessica had been my partner, my anchor. But that anchor felt like it was slipping, dragging me into uncharted waters. The sound of the mail slot snapping open broke my thoughts. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside to retrieve the stack of envelopes, bills, holiday catalogs, and something else. Tucked between an ad for a local hardware store and a bank statement was a plain, white envelope with no return address. It felt out of place, its pristine surface untouched by rain. Inside was a single card. The handwriting was neat, almost clinical. David, you deserve to know the truth about Jessica. Some secrets shouldn't stay hidden. My breath caught as I read the words. My mind raced with possibilities. A prank, a mistake, someone's cruel idea of a joke. But as I stood there, the card trembling in my hands, another thought crept in. What if it wasn't a mistake? Jessica was already dressed when I walked back inside. She stood by the dining table, scrolling through her phone, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder. You're up early, I said, slipping the card into my back pocket. Big day, she replied without looking up. Lots to do before the holidays. With Lindsay? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Jessica paused, her fingers hovering over the screen. Among others, she said finally, her voice clipped. I nodded, watching as she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Don't wait up, she called over her shoulder, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to focus on work at the cafe, but the card's words played on a loop in my mind. You deserve to know the truth. By the time I got home that evening, the house was dark. Jessica's car was in the driveway, but the lights inside were off. I stepped into the living room, expecting to find her on the couch or in the kitchen, but the space was empty. The Christmas tree stood in its corner, the crooked star still tilted to one side. I reached out to straighten it, but stopped. Something about the imperfection felt fitting, like a mirror of the cracks forming in our life together. David. I turned to see Jessica standing in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the glow of the street lights outside. She was holding a glass of wine, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. You're home early, she said, stepping into the room. Her tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, like she was testing the waters. So are you, I replied, forcing a smile. She raised an eyebrow, leaning against the doorframe. Is something wrong? For a moment, I considered showing her the card. I wanted to see her reaction, to hear her explanation, but instead, I shook my head. No, just tired. Jessica studied me for a moment before taking a sip of her wine. Well, don't let me keep you up, she said, turning and disappearing up the stairs. The next morning, I decided to take action. The card had been haunting me, its words seeping into every thought. If someone had sent it to me, they wanted me to know something. And if they wanted me to know, there had to be proof. Jessica was already gone by the time I got out of bed. No note, no text, just the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway. I spent the next hour searching the house, opening drawers, rifling through closets, looking for, I didn't even know what. It wasn't until I reached her office that I found something. Tucked beneath a stack of papers on her desk was an envelope. It was plain and unmarked, much like the one I'd received the day before. But inside was something else entirely, a receipt. The logo at the top was from an upscale hotel in the city, dated just 2 nights ago. My stomach churned as I read the details. Dinner for two, a bottle of champagne, and a room charge. The name on the receipt wasn't Jessica's. It wasn't mine either. It was a man's name. That night, Jessica came home with the same polished smile and the same perfectly rehearsed excuses. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat across from me at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing intermittently beside her. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone light. "Productive," I said. Watching her carefully, Jessica sipped her wine, her eyes flicking to her phone as another message lit up the screen. "That's good," she said absently. "Who's Michael?" Her hand froze halfway to her lips, the glass trembling slightly. "What?" "Michael," I said again, my voice calm but firm, the name on the hotel receipt. Jessica set the glass down, her smile faltering. "David, it's not what you think. Then what is it?" I interrupted, "Because it looks like you've been lying to me." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in months, Jessica looked completely unprepared. Jessica stared at me, her carefully composed mask cracking. For a moment, the kitchen was filled with nothing but the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. "David," she began, her voice low, almost pleading, "you're blowing this out of proportion." Michael is what?" I interrupted, keeping my voice calm even as my chest tightened. "A colleague? A client? A friend?" Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. "It's not what you think," she said finally. "We had dinner to discuss council business. That's all. The hotel was just convenient. I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Is that what they call champagne in a room for two these days?" Jessica flinched, her hands clenching the edge of the table. "You don't understand." She snapped, her tone defensive. "I've been under so much pressure lately. More than you could ever imagine, and lying to me makes that easier." I shot back, the calm facade starting to crack. "I didn't lie," she said quickly, too quickly. I didn't want to burden you with details. You're always so busy with your cafe." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice rising. "Don't you dare use my work as an excuse for whatever this is." Jessica's expression hardened, the pleading tone in her voice replaced by something colder. "You're not perfect either, David," she said, her words like a dagger. "You bury yourself in that cafe, pretending like everything's fine, while I'm out there trying to make a difference in the world. Do you even care about what I do? About who I've become?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built a life with, and realized I barely recognized her. "I care, Jessica," I said quietly. "I've always cared," but this I gestured to the receipt still lying on the table. "This isn't about making a difference. This is about you choosing to keep secrets instead of being honest with me." For a moment, Jessica said nothing. Then she pushed back her chair, grabbing her glass of wine and heading toward the living room. "We're not doing this tonight," she said over her shoulder. I didn't follow her. Instead, I sat at the table, staring at the receipt, the words blurring as my mind raced. The card, the late nights, the expensive gifts, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and I was starting to see the picture they formed, but I needed more. The next day, Jessica left early, barely saying a word. She didn't leave a note this time, and I didn't text her. I spent the morning at the cafe, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about the man in the cafe, the way Jessica had laughed with him, her hand brushing his arm. I thought about the receipt and the card. By the time I got home, the tension in my chest had turned into resolve. That evening, Jessica returned home with an almost exaggerated cheerfulness. She walked in carrying a bag of groceries, her voice bright as she called out, "I thought I'd make dinner tonight." It was so unlike her that I couldn't help but feel suspicious. Jessica rarely cooked these days. Her time was always spent on meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. "Sounds great," I said, forcing a smile as she set the groceries on the counter. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," she said quickly. "Just thought it'd be nice to spend some time together." As she busied herself with chopping vegetables, I leaned against the counter watching her. The brightness in her voice, the way she avoided eye contact, it all felt calculated, like she was trying too hard to play the role of the attentive wife. "Jessica," I said after a long pause, "what's really going on?" She froze for a fraction of a second before resuming her chopping. "What do you mean?" "You've been different lately," I said carefully. "Distant, secretive. Jessica laughed, but it sounded forced. David, you're imagining things. Work's just been stressful, that's all. Stress doesn't explain a hotel receipt, I said, my voice steady. The knife in her hand clattered onto the cutting board. She turned to face me, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. I told you it's not what you think. Michael is a mistake? I interrupted. A fling? What? Jessica? Just tell me the truth. Her eyes welled up with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or frustration. I don't owe you an explanation for every second of my life. She snapped. No, but you owe me honesty, I replied, my voice firm. Jessica stared at me, her jaw tight, before turning back to the cutting board. I can't do this right now, she muttered. After dinner, Jessica retreated upstairs while I stayed in the living room, staring at the Christmas tree. The star at the top still sat crooked, its tilted angle a silent reminder of how far we drifted. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the picture I'd taken of her and the man outside the cafe. My thumb hovered over the send button, tempted to forward it to her with the caption, "Explain this," but something held me back. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched for the hotel listed on the receipt. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The website's reservation system allowed users to search for bookings by name, and within seconds, I had the confirmation. Michael's name, Jessica's email. The booking had been for 2 nights, not 1. Jessica came downstairs an hour later, her face calm, but her eyes heavy. She stopped in the doorway, watching me as I closed the laptop. Everything okay? She asked, her voice soft. I looked at her, my heart pounding in my chest. Jessica, I said, my voice steady. Is there something you need to tell me? Her expression didn't change, but the faintest flicker of panic crossed her eyes. No, she said quietly, nothing at all. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. Jessica's side of the bed was still warm, her scent lingering faintly on the sheets. For a moment, I lay there staring at the ceiling, hoping the last few days had been some bizarre dream. But the laptop on my desk, the bookmarked hotel confirmation, and the image of Jessica and Michael outside the cafe told me otherwise. Downstairs, the Christmas lights cast soft, flickering shadows across the living room. The star atop the tree was still crooked, the sight of it now more bitter than nostalgic. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared out the window at the empty street. Jessica wasn't up yet, but I knew she'd be leaving soon. Lately, her schedule had been as predictable as her excuses. She came downstairs an hour later, dressed in a charcoal blazer and black slacks. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup subtle but flawless. She paused in the doorway, her gaze lingering on me for a second too long. You're up early, she said, her tone cautious. So are you, I replied, not looking up from my coffee. Jessica walked over to the counter and poured herself a glass of water. I have another meeting today, she said, her voice light. It might run late, so don't wait up. Another meeting, I repeated, setting my mug down. With Michael, her hand froze halfway to her glass. For a split second, her mask slipped, and I caught the flicker of panic in her eyes. David, she said slowly, I don't know what you think is going on, but stop, I interrupted. My voice calm, but firm. No more excuses, Jessica. No more lies. I know about the hotel. I know about Michael. I've seen the booking. 2 nights, champagne, dinner for 2. You even used your own email. Her face drained of color. I can explain, she whispered, setting the glass down with trembling hands. I'm listening, I said, crossing my arms. Jessica looked away, her breath hitching as she struggled to form words. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she began, her voice shaking. Michael and I, it's not what you think. It just happened. Just happened. I repeated, my voice rising. You've been sneaking around for months, lying to my face, using Lindsay as a cover, and it just happened? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not this time. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice cracking. But you did, I said coldly. You didn't care about hurting me. You didn't care about this family. All you cared about was yourself. Jessica wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. David, please just listen. I've done enough listening, I said, cutting her off. Now it's my turn to talk. I stood there, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on me like a stone. The anger, The betrayal, the frustration, it all boiled to the surface. Do you have any idea how hard I've tried to keep this family together? I said, my voice trembling with emotion. How many nights I've stayed up, wondering where we went wrong, trying to fix something that you've been tearing apart behind my back. Jessica flinched, her face crumpling. It wasn't like that, she pleaded. I was lonely. David, you're always so focused on the cafe, on your traditions. I felt invisible. Invisible? I snapped, stepping closer. I've done everything for you, Jessica, for this family. And instead of talking to me, instead of trying to work through it, you ran off to Michael? Her silence was deafening. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Jessica looked down at the floor, her tears falling silently onto the tiles. I felt nothing but a hollow ache where my heart used to be. You need to leave, I said finally, my voice cold and steady. Jessica's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. What? You heard me, I said. Pack your things and go. You've already made your choice, Jessica. Now live with it. David, please, she sobbed, stepping toward me. It was a mistake. I'll fix it, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes. It's too late, I said, cutting her off. You don't fix this. You don't undo months of lying and betrayal with empty promises. You broke us, Jessica. You broke me, and I can't come back from that. Jessica spent the next hour upstairs, the sound of her muffled sobs drifting down the staircase. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the crooked star on the tree. When she came back down, she was carrying 2 suitcases. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. I'll stay at Lindsay's, she said quietly, avoiding my gaze. I didn't respond. I couldn't. As the door closed behind her, the house fell silent. That evening, I sat by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in my hand. The Christmas lights twinkled softly, their glow casting long shadows across the room. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Jessica was gone, the truth was out. And though the pain of her betrayal still lingered, I knew this was the beginning of something new. Tomorrow, I would fix the star on the tree, but tonight I would let it stay crooked. The morning after Jessica left, the house felt different. Quiet, yes, but not the suffocating silence I'd grown used to. This was a quieter kind of quiet, peaceful, clean, like the air after a storm. I stood in the living room, staring at the Christmas tree. The star was still crooked, its angle mocking me like it always had. I walked over and reached up, gripping it in my hand. For a moment, I considered fixing it, straightening it out, making it perfect. But then I let it go. The day passed in a blur. At the cafe, the regulars were their usual cheerful selves, talking about holiday plans and exchanging gifts. I played along, smiling and joking, but my mind was elsewhere. Around noon, the door jingled, and I looked up to see my daughter, Emily, standing there. She was bundled up in a red scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Surprised, she said, grinning as she walked over to the counter. Emily, I said, smiling for the first time in what felt like days. What are you doing here? I thought you weren't coming until Christmas Eve. I caught an earlier flight, she said, shrugging. Figured you could use some help with the tree. I froze for a moment, my smile faltering. Emily had always loved decorating the tree with Jessica. It was their thing. She must have noticed my hesitation because her smile faded. Is Mom? She's not here, I said quietly. She's staying with a friend for a while. Emily frowned, her brows knitting together. Dad, what's going on? I hesitated, but then the words spilled out about the late nights, the lies, the hotel receipt. I didn't give her every detail, but enough for her to understand. By the time I finished, Emily's face was a mix of anger and sadness. I can't believe her, she said, shaking her head. How could she do this to you, to us? I didn't have an answer. That evening, Emily and I worked on the tree together. She pulled out the old ornaments, laughing as she remembered the stories behind each one. I found myself smiling along with her, the weight on my chest lifting ever so slightly. When we finished, Emily stood back and studied the tree. It's missing something, she said, tilting her head. I knew what she meant. I walked over, picked up the star, and handed it to her. Your turn, I said. Emily smiled and climbed onto the step stool. She placed the star on top, adjusting it until it was perfectly straight. There, she said, stepping back. Perfect. For the first time in weeks, I agreed. The next day, my son Matthew arrived. He was quieter than Emily, but no less supportive. We sat in the kitchen that night, the three of us sharing stories and laughing. For a little while, it felt like the old days, before the cracks began to show. When Christmas morning came, the house was filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. Emily and Matthew sat by the tree, unwrapping presents and teasing each other like they always did. For the first time in a long time, I felt okay. Not whole, not yet, but better. That afternoon, as I was cleaning up wrapping paper, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing on the porch. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a navy coat, his expression cautious but kind. "David?" he asked. "Yes," I said, frowning. "Can I help you?" "Michael," he said, extending a hand, "I think we need to talk." We sat in the living room, the sound of carols playing softly in the background. Michael sipped the coffee I'd offered him, his hands wrapped around the mug like it was a lifeline. "I want to start by saying I didn't know," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "When Jessica and I started whatever this was, she told me your marriage was over, that you were separated." I didn't respond, but my grip on my own mug tightened. "It wasn't until recently that I realized she wasn't being honest," he continued. "When I found out the truth, I ended things. That's why she's been off. She's been trying to fix things with you." I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix things?" "She lied to both of us, Michael. There's no fixing that." Michael nodded, his expression somber. I needed you to know. I didn't want you thinking I was some homewrecker. You were," I said bluntly, "whether you knew it or not." Michael winced, but didn't argue. As he stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope you find peace. You deserve it." I didn't reply. That night, I sat by the fireplace, staring at the glowing embers. The house was quiet again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. The star on the tree shone brightly, its light reflecting off the ornaments. I thought about the years Jessica and I had spent building this life together, the memories we'd shared, the love that had once felt unbreakable. It was gone now, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Tomorrow was a new day, and I was ready for it.